The landlord threw the cancer patient and her 3 children out into the street with zero mercy.
What the whole neighborhood didn't know would break their hearts and change everything they thought about compassion. But first, let me tell you about a woman's fight for survival, a community's rush to judgment, and the man who sacrificed everything to save a family while destroying his own reputation. Welcome to Still Human, where we uncover the hidden truths behind the stories that break our hearts and rebuild our faith. Before we dive into this incredible tale of sacrifice, judgment, and the most beautiful deception ever told, tell us where you're watching from today. Because this story will change how you see every act of apparent cruelness for the rest of your life. Now back to Maple Street, where nothing was what it seemed. Sarah Martinez had been fighting stage 3 breast cancer for 8 months when the eviction notice appeared on her door. Taped to the faded blue paint of her small duplex apartment, the official document might as well have been a death sentence. 30 days to vacate. No exceptions, no extensions, no mercy. Inside the 2-bedroom unit she shared with her 3 children, Emma 8, Carlos 6, and baby Sophia just 18 months, Sarah sank onto the second-hand couch and tried not to let her children see her cry. The chemotherapy had stolen her hair, her energy, and most of her hope. Now it seemed like her landlord, Robert Chen, was about to steal the last thing she had left, a roof over her children's heads. Sarah had been late on rent before, but never this late. 3 months behind, with no end to her medical bills in sight. Her part-time job at the grocery store barely covered her medications, let alone the $1,200 monthly rent for their small apartment. She'd applied for assistance, begged relatives for help, and even started a small GoFundMe page that had raised exactly $127 in 2 weeks. But none of that mattered to Robert Chen. At least, that's what everyone on Maple Street believed. Robert owned 4 properties on the quiet residential street in suburban Phoenix, small duplexes and single-family homes that he rented to working families, single mothers, and elderly couples on fixed incomes. At 52, he had inherited the properties from his father and managed them with what neighbors considered ruthless efficiency. Rent was due on the 1st, late fees began on the 3rd, and eviction proceedings started at 60 days behind. No exceptions, no sob stories, no mercy. He's heartless, whispered Maria Santos, who lived 3 houses down. That poor woman is dying, and he's going to put her babies on the street.
The neighborhood had watched Sarah's battle with cancer with the helpless sympathy of people who wanted to help but couldn't afford to save someone else when they were barely saving themselves. They'd organized a few small fundraisers, a bake sale that raised $243, a car wash that brought in $156, but it wasn't enough to make a real difference in Sarah's impossible situation. What they could do was judge Robert Chen, and judge him they did. "I've lived on this street for 15 years, said Tom Bradley, Sarah's next-door neighbor. "I've watched that man evict 3 families, never seen him show an ounce of compassion. It's all about the money with him." The whispers grew louder when Robert's black Honda Accord pulled into Sarah's driveway on a Tuesday morning in October. Through their windows, neighbors watched him knock on her door, wait for her to answer, and hand her another official-looking document. They couldn't hear the conversation, but they could see Sarah's shoulders shake with what appeared to be sobs. What they didn't see was Robert's hands trembling as he delivered the final eviction notice. What they didn't hear was his voice breaking slightly as he said, "Mrs. Martinez, I'm sorry, but you have 72 hours. What they couldn't know was that this was the hardest thing Robert Chen had ever done in his life. Because Robert Chen wasn't heartless, he was desperate. For 8 months, since Sarah's diagnosis, Robert had been watching his tenant struggle with medical bills that would have bankrupted most families. He'd seen her weight drop as the chemotherapy ravaged her body, He'd heard her children asking why Mommy was always so tired, why she wore scarves on her head, why the medicine made her sick. And for 8 months, Robert had been trying to figure out how to save her without destroying her pride. The first month, Sarah was late on rent. Robert had simply marked it as paid in his books and covered the shortfall from his own savings account. When she apologized and tried to explain about the medical bills, he waved her off with a gruff, "These things happen. Don't worry about it." The second month, he did the same thing, and the third. By the fourth month, Robert had paid over $4,800 of Sarah's rent out of his own pocket, but he'd also realized that his current approach wasn't sustainable. His own financial situation was more precarious than his tenants realized. The rental income from his 4 properties was his only source of income, and covering Sarah's rent was forcing him to dip into his father's small inheritance, money he'd planned to use for his own retirement. But the real problem wasn't financial. It was pride. Robert had tried offering Sarah direct help once. That's when Robert realized that Sarah Martinez would rather be homeless than accept what she perceived as pity. She was the kind of woman who had worked 2 jobs before her diagnosis, who had never asked for government assistance despite qualifying for it, who had insisted on making partial rent payments even when he told her not to worry about it. Sarah Martinez would die before she'd accept charity, and she was literally dying. So Robert Chen developed a plan that would save Sarah's life while destroying his own reputation. It was morally complex, financially risky, and emotionally devastating. It was also the most compassionate thing anyone had ever done on Maple Street. The plan required Robert to become the villain. The eviction notice was real. The 72-hour deadline was enforceable. And when Sarah's neighbors called Robert to plead for mercy, his responses were exactly what they expected from a heartless landlord. "Business is business. I can't run a charity. She needs to pay or get out." Behind the scenes, Robert was working frantically to coordinate with local housing authorities, charitable organizations, and social services. He discovered that Sarah qualified for emergency housing assistance, a program that would pay her rent directly to landlords and provide additional support for medical expenses. But there was a catch. Sarah had to be officially homeless to qualify for the emergency services. The eviction wasn't about getting Sarah out of the apartment. It was about getting her into the system that could save her life. On the day of the eviction, Maple Street looked like a disaster zone. Sarah's few belongings sat in cardboard boxes on the front lawn. Her children cried quietly, while neighbors offered water, snacks, and places to stay for a few nights. Someone had called the local news station, and a camera crew was documenting what appeared to be the cruelest eviction in the city's history. Robert Chen arrived at 3 p.m. sharp, accompanied by a sheriff's deputy, as required by law. He looked every inch the heartless landlord. Expensive suit, clipboard full of legal documents, expression that revealed nothing. The neighbors gathered in a protective circle around Sarah and her children, their hostility toward Robert almost physical in its intensity. "This is shameful," shouted Maria Santos. "Those are babies, and their mother is dying." "You're a monster," added Tom Bradley. "I hope you can sleep at night knowing what you've done." Robert said nothing. He supervised the final removal of Sarah's belongings, handed her a formal notice confirming the eviction was complete, and walked back to his car without meeting anyone's eyes. As he drove away, he could see the neighbors closing ranks around Sarah, offering. Phase 2 of Robert's plan began immediately. Within an hour of the eviction, Sarah received a call from Maria Gonzalez at the Maricopa County Emergency Housing Services. A bed had opened up at a transitional housing facility specifically designed for families in medical crisis. The facility provided free accommodation, meals, transportation to medical appointments, and on-site childcare. Most importantly, it offered direct financial assistance that could help Sarah get back on her feet once her treatment was complete. "But I don't understand," Sarah said, holding baby Sophia, while Emma and Carlos played with toys provided by the neighbors. "I applied for this program 6 months ago and was told there was a waiting list." "Sometimes these things move quickly," Maria Gonzalez replied. "A spot just opened up, and your case was flagged as high priority due to your medical situation. Can you be here by 6 p.m. tonight?" What Sarah didn't know was that Robert Chen had spent 3 weeks negotiating with housing services, offering to pay the facility's waiting list fees and provide additional funding for program expansion in exchange for prioritizing Sarah's case. He'd also arranged for the medical assistance program to cover her outstanding medical bills and provide ongoing support throughout her treatment. The transition housing was everything Sarah hadn't dared to hope for: a clean, safe apartment in a secure facility with other families facing similar challenges. Professional support staff who understood the complexities of medical crises, educational programs for the children, and job training for parents preparing to re-enter the workforce. For the first time since her diagnosis, Sarah could focus entirely on getting well instead of worrying about keeping her family housed and fed. Meanwhile, on Maple Street, Robert Chen had become the neighborhood pariah. Someone spray-painted "Heartless" on his garage door. His car was keyed twice. Mrs. Henderson from the corner house organized a petition to ban slumlords from our community. The local news story about Sarah's eviction had included Robert's name and property address, leading to angry phone calls and threatening emails. Robert accepted it all without complaint or explanation. When neighbors confronted him directly, he gave the same response: "I run a business, not a charity." When reporters asked for comment, he declined interviews. When housing rights activists picketed his properties, he simply walked past them without acknowledgement. The plan was working perfectly, but the cost was higher than Robert had anticipated. The financial strain of supporting Sarah's transition and covering the housing program fees had forced him to take out loans against his properties. The public hatred had isolated him from a community where he'd lived for 20 years. The constant stress of maintaining his heartless landlord persona while secretly coordinating Sarah's care was affecting his health. But worst of all was watching Sarah's neighbors treat him like a monster when he desperately wanted them to know the truth about what he'd done for her. 6 months later, Sarah Martinez was in remission. Her cancer treatment had been successful, partly due to the stress-free environment and comprehensive support she'd received at the transitional housing facility. She'd completed job training as a medical billing specialist and secured a position with excellent health insurance. The housing program had helped her qualify for a subsidized apartment in a good school district, and her children were thriving in their new environment. For the first time in over a year, Sarah had hope. She also had questions. "I need to understand something," Sarah said to Maria Gonzalez during their final case conference. "The timing of everything. The housing opening up exactly when I needed it, the medical assistance covering all my bills, the job training program that was perfectly suited to my background. It all seemed too convenient." Maria smiled carefully. "Sometimes the system works the way it's supposed to. You'd qualified for all these services for months. It just took time for everything to align." "But someone paid the fees to expedite my case, didn't they?" and someone covered the costs that the regular programs wouldn't pay for. I've been in this system long enough to know how it works. This level of support doesn't happen without someone making it happen. Sarah had always been smart. Cancer hadn't changed that. I can't discuss the specifics of funding sources, Maria replied, but I can tell you that someone believed very strongly that you and your children deserved a chance to rebuild your lives. That evening, Sarah drove back to Maple Street. For the first time since her eviction, she told herself she just wanted to thank the neighbors who had supported her during the worst day of her life. But really, she wanted to confront Robert Chen. She found him in his backyard, tending to a small vegetable garden. He looked older than she remembered, thinner, with gray at his temples that hadn't been there 8 months ago. When he saw her approaching, his expression shifted to the careful neutrality she remembered from their landlord-tenant interactions. "Mrs. Martinez, I heard you were doing better. I'm glad. Mr. Chen, I want to ask you something, and I want you to tell me the truth." Robert straightened, garden tools still in his hands. "Of course. Did you pay for my housing assistance?" The question hung in the air between them. Robert's first instinct was to deny it, to maintain the fiction that had saved Sarah's pride and her life. But looking at her now, healthy, strong, confident, he realized that she no longer needed protection from the truth. "The housing program has many funding sources," he said carefully. "That's not what I asked." Sarah stepped closer. "I've been thinking about this for months. The timing, the level of assistance, the way everything fell into place exactly when I needed it. Someone made that happen. Someone with resources and connections and a reason to care about what happened to my family." Robert set down his tools and sat heavily on a small garden bench. The weight of 8 months of secrecy and public hatred suddenly felt unbearable. "You needed to qualify for emergency assistance," he said quietly, "but you couldn't qualify while you were housed, even inadequately. The system required you to be officially homeless to access the programs that could actually help you long-term." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "You knew that. You planned it. You would never have accepted direct help from me. I tried that approach early on, and you made it clear that you preferred to struggle rather than accept what you saw as charity. But you would accept help from official programs because you'd earned that assistance through your situation. So, you evicted me to save me. I evicted you to get you into a system that could do more for you than I ever could. The transitional housing, the medical assistance, the job training, those programs exist for people exactly like you. But the waiting lists are long, and the bureaucracy is slow, and people sometimes die waiting for help that should be available immediately." Sarah was crying now, but she was also angry. "Do you have any idea what that day did to me? What it did to my children? Emma still has nightmares about being homeless." "I know," Robert said, and his voice broke slightly. "I know exactly what it cost you, and I know it was traumatic. And I know you may never forgive me for putting you through it. But you're alive, Sarah. You're healthy. You have a good job. Your children are in a better school. And you have support systems that will help you for years to come. If I had to choose between your temporary trauma and your long-term survival, I'd make the same choice again." They sat in silence for several minutes, processing the weight of what had been revealed. Finally, Sarah spoke. "The neighbors hate you. They think you're a monster." "I know. You could have explained. You could have told them what you were really doing. If I'd explained, word would have gotten back to you eventually. And if you'd known that I was manipulating the system to help you, you would have refused the assistance out of pride. Your family would have ended up homeless anyway, but without access to the programs that saved your life." Sarah realized that Robert's reputation on Maple Street would never recover. Even now, knowing the truth, She couldn't publicly vindicate him without undermining the pride and independence that had been so crucial to her recovery. The narrative that had saved her, that she'd qualified for assistance on her own merit rather than through charity, required Robert to remain the villain. "What can I do?" she asked. "How can I make this right?" "You can live," Robert said simply. "You can raise your children and stay healthy, and build the life you've earned. That's all I ever wanted." As Sarah drove away from Maple Street that evening, she carried with her a secret that she would never be able to fully share. She couldn't tell her neighbors what Robert had really done, without destroying the very independence he'd helped her achieve. She couldn't publicly vindicate the man who had saved her life, without admitting that her success had been orchestrated rather than earned. But she could make sure that Robert Chen's sacrifice wasn't forgotten, even if it couldn't be acknowledged. Sarah never moved back to Maple Street, but she drove by regularly. She watched Robert tend his garden, maintain his properties, and endure the continued hostility of neighbors who would never know what he'd done for her family. She saw him age under the weight of secrets and public hatred, and she carried the guilt of knowing that her salvation had come at the cost of another person's reputation and peace. 2 years later, when Sarah had been promoted to supervisor at her job and Emma had won a school award for academic excellence, she wrote Robert a letter. Not a thank you note, but something deeper. "Mr. Chen, I want you to know that every day of happiness my children experience, every milestone we celebrate, every moment of security we enjoy, all of it exists because you were willing to be seen as cruel in order to be kind. I understand now that the greatest acts of compassion sometimes require the actor to appear compassionate at all. I don't know if I would have had your courage or your wisdom. I hope someday I can repay what you've given us, but I know that's impossible. The debt is too large, and the gift is too precious. Thank you for saving my family. Thank you for sacrificing your reputation for our future. And thank you for teaching me that kindness doesn't always look like what we expect it to look like." Robert never responded to the letter, but he kept it in a frame on his kitchen table, next to a photo of Sarah and her children that she'd included. It reminded him that sometimes the people who judge us harshest are the ones who understand us least, and sometimes the greatest acts of love require the lover to be misunderstood. The neighbors on Maple Street never learned the truth about Robert Chen's heartless eviction. They continued to see him as the man who had thrown a cancer patient and her children into the street. But Sarah Martinez knew better. She knew that the cruelest thing that had ever happened to her family had actually been the kindest. And she knew that true compassion sometimes wears the mask of cruelty, while true love sometimes demands that the lover be hated. In a world quick to judge and slow to understand, Robert Chen had proven that the most beautiful deceptions are the ones that save lives while destroying reputations.
He had shown that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to let them hate you for helping them.
The man the neighborhood saw as a monster was actually an angel who had traded his wings for their survival. Subscribe to Still Human for more incredible stories of sacrifice, hidden kindness, and the people who save lives while destroying their own reputations.
Thank you for being part of the Still Human family.
Every view, like, and share helps us spread stories that remind us to look deeper,
Judge less,
and recognize that sometimes love wears the mask of cruelty to protect the dignity of those it serves. The neighborhood never knew what broke their hearts. Now you do.